Welcome to Know Your History. I'm Mr. Ben. Did you know that a man from Swedesboro once commanded one of the most famous and important ships in all of naval American history? His name was William Nicholson Jeffers, and he was born right here in Swedesboro, New Jersey, on October 16th, 1824. Now, Jeffers wanted to be in the Navy from when he was just a child. His father was a lawyer, a distinguished member of the West Jersey Bar. And of course, like most fathers, he wanted his son to follow in his footsteps. But Jeffers had a desire to go to sea, and so he enrolled in the Naval Academy in 1846. Now, he was a past midshipman right when he graduated and right when the Mexican War began. And he was sent on board the USS Vixen to fight the war against Mexico. Now, the Mexicans really didn't have much of a navy, so the Vixen spent a lot of time bombarding shore installations and helping guard the transports and bombarding Veracruz. And then soon the war was over. And Jeffers was back at this time as an instructor at the Naval Academy teaching mathematics. He was a very smart fellow. In 1855, I guess I should show you a picture of him. And there he is. In 1855, Jeffers was the executive officer on a ship called the Water Witch, a side-wheel paddle steamer that sailed to Central America and was conducting an exploration of the river La Plata in Paraguay, also known as Paraguay, when a fort opened fire on the ship, killing one sailor. The ship, the Water Witch, returned fire, but she only had 2 small brass cannons. Eventually, with time, the dispute was settled, and Paraguay apologized and provided an indemnity to the slain sailor. In these waters, Lieutenant Jeffers was given a commendation and a gold sword from the Queen of Spain for his efforts in rescuing a Spanish schooner that was foundering off the coast of Panama. Now, at the beginning of the Civil War, Jeffers was by now renowned for his scientific attainments. He had become an expert in naval ordnance. And in 1862, he took part in an expedition, a combined Army-Navy expedition to take back the North Carolina coast. And his commanding officer was Louis Goldsborough on the left. And the Army general, it was called the Burnside Expedition, General Ambrose Burnside. You might be interested to know that the term sideburns comes from General Burnside. I can't think why, unless it's those luxurious whiskers that he has on the side of his face. But the campaign was a success, and Jeffers had served with zeal and intelligence, according to his superior officer. Meanwhile, there was a terrible battle fought in Hampton Roads in 1862 in Virginia, and it featured the aforementioned Monitor and the CSS Virginia, although she's more famously known as the Merrimack. You've heard of this one, the battle between the Monitor and the Merrimack, where for 4.5 hours the two ships, the two ironclads, pounded away at each other with little effect. Neither ship could damage or sink the other. In fact, the only serious casualty of the battle was the man who was in charge of the Monitor, Lieutenant John L. Worden. Now, Worden had the misfortune, he was peering out of the slit in the pilot box, when a shell from the Merrimack exploded against the pilot house, and he was temporarily blinded. And I'll show you this one again. This is the monitor, and that rectangular box, that's the pilot house. And there would have been an eye slit. And just as Worden was looking out of this slit, the shell exploded and driving metal fragments into his eyes. He would regain sight eventually. But for now, the command of the monitor devolved upon Lieutenant Dana Green, a man with very little experience. So the Navy needed somebody to command its most important warship. And that person, with 22 years of experience, was Lieutenant William Nicholson Jeffers. Now, this is an actual photograph of Jeffers on the monitor. And you'll note just to the left of that empty chair is a very large dent that the turret of the monitor received from one of the Merrimac's cannonballs. Just a little information about the ship itself. The monitor, if you look at it, most of it is actually underwater. Here's the water line. And of course, its most innovative feature is the revolving turret with the two 11-inch Dahlgren guns. And the boilers, the engine room, everything is underwater. It's almost like a submarine. And it was designed by a man named John Ericsson, a Swede who invented this, the turret, and it was invented before, but he gets credit for it. Getting back to Commander Jeffers, he is someone that the crew just didn't really cotton to. They didn't like him because he was a very autocratic, very rigid disciplinarian. If a sailor was drunk, he would chain him to the deck for 3 or 4 days. In fact, when two sailors were caught fighting, he had them chained together on the deck, with their hands manacled behind each other's backs, and there they stayed on the deck for 3 or 4 days. Now, sailors are always getting into scrapes now and then. It seemed kind of cruel and unusual punishment. Now, Jeffers wanted to get at the Merrimac, and on 3 occasions, the Merrimac steamed out of her berth at Gosport Navy Yard, came down the Elizabeth River, and came out into the roads, Hampton Roads, where the first battle was fought, as if to challenge the Monitor to another duel. But the Monitor was under orders not to engage the Merrimac. The reason for this was because McClellan's Peninsular Campaign was getting underway, and there were hundreds of ships, Union ships, transports, bringing the troops and supplies and ammunition and guns, and everything was being offloaded at Fortress Monroe at the tip of the Virginia Peninsula. So it was the Monitor's job to keep the Merrimac from interfering with all this activity. And it was really the only ship, the only ironclad in the Union's arsenal right now, and the only ship that could stand up to the Merrimac. So the crew blamed Jeffers, but it really wasn't his fault. It was the dictates of the Secretary of War, Gideon Welles. President Lincoln liked to call Gideon Welles Father Neptune. He kind of had a big beard like Santa Claus, and he wore kind of an ill-fitting wig. Kind of unusual looking fellow. But Jeffers was under strict orders not to risk another battle with the Merrimac. Then one day, Jeffers got a visit on the Monitor from the Commander-in-Chief. And hands were shaken all around, and President Lincoln commended the crew and the officers for the engagement with the Merrimac. And he gave Jeffers permission, in fact, to kind of encourage him to go after the Merrimac the next time she sortied out. Unfortunately for the Confederates and the career of the Merrimac, the Union Army, at Lincoln's prodding, as McClellan was investing Yorktown, some other Union troops captured Norfolk. So Norfolk is near where the berth, where Merrimac's berth was, so she couldn't stay there. And she had too deep a draft to go up the James River, 22 feet draft. Plus, she couldn't go past the blockade and the forts and go out to sea, and she was very unseaworthy. So the only option the Confederates were left with was to destroy her themselves. So her own crew had to blow up the Merrimac rather than let her fall into Union hands. So the terrible monster, the Monitor's nemesis, was gone. Well, this opened up things considerably, particularly up the James River. And now the James River was open all the way to Richmond, Virginia, the capital of the Confederacy, or at least so it was thought. Now, a flotilla of 5 ships, including the Monitor, was ordered up the James River. And it seemed like clear sailing for the most part, except for the occasional sharpshooter and obstructions to get around. But as they were nearing Richmond, only 8 miles away, there was a sharp right-hand turn in the river. And up on a bluff 150 feet above the river was a fort, Fort Darling, commanded by Confederates who had heavy naval ordnance, some of the guns even from the Virginia or Merrimac, CSS Virginia, and some of the crew were manning those guns at Fort Darling. And they were able to fire down on this little flotilla of ships that was trying to get to Richmond to shell the city. Well, they didn't, and they would have had to gotten past the obstructions there at this point in the river at that right-hand turn. First, they would have to reduce the forts in order to remove the obstructions. Not only was there heavy naval ordnance firing down on them from the fort, on the Monitor and the flotilla, but there was also Confederate sharpshooters lining both sides of the river. And although this did not affect the crew of the Monitor too much because they could stay inside of their ironclad ship, but the wooden ships had a problem with this. And some of the sailors were being picked off by the Confederate sharpshooters. Inside the Monitor, Jeffers recorded a temperature of 140 degrees in the turret. It was a hot day. It was May 15th, 1862, and it was humid. And that between the firing of the guns, the sulfurous fumes, and the temperature, some of the sailors, even the strongest ones, were going faint. Those cannonballs the solid shot each weighed 180 pounds. But part of the problem was the Monitor was unable to elevate her guns high enough to hit the fort on top of the bluff. Now the Galena, which was the flagship commanded by Captain Rogers, was hit multiple times and sustained a number of casualties. Jeffers tried to draw off fire by pulling in front of the Galena, but the Confederates seemed to realize that it would be a waste of ammunition to concentrate their fire on the Monitor. As it was, they only struck her with 3 shots, none of them doing any serious damage. So when the Galena was out of ammunition, Captain Rogers ordered the flotilla to back down the river. And as they were sailing away, one of the officers, Lieutenant John Taylor Wood, who had been aboard the Virginia, yelled out to the Monitor, "Tell Captain Jeffers that is not the way to Richmond." Kind of taunting him there. So after that battle, the Monitor was on blockade duty in the James River, and they were also told to guard against any Confederate ships coming down the river from Richmond. They were building another ironclad to replace the Virginia, aka Merrimac. And it was at Harrison's Landing, mostly, where they were sitting there in the river, and it was extremely hot. You can imagine sitting in this iron ship. It was very hot during the day, and then it was hard to sleep at night. And if you went out on deck, you were eaten alive by the mosquitoes. And you can see Jefferson and 2 of his officers in the wardroom sweating it out. It was very uncomfortable. And eventually, Jeffers asked for a transfer after the long, hot summer on the James River. Plus, the monitor needed repairs. She needed an overhaul, and eventually she was sent back to Washington. And Jeffers got his transfer. He started to work in the Ordnance Bureau in Washington, and that's where he remained for the rest of the war. The crew was not sad to see him go. In fact, Fireman George Gear wrote that nobody was sad to see him go. We like our new captain very much. He is not such an old windbag as Jeffers was. Jeffers had been replaced by Captain Stevens, Thomas H. Stevens. Well, despite what the crew may have thought about Commander Jeffers, his career was pretty stellar. He was given command of another ship. He stayed in the Ordnance Department, which was his real expertise, and he was given command of another ship, the USS Swatara, in the European Squadron in March of 1866. And he went to Alexandria, Egypt, to bring back one of the Lincoln assassination conspirators, John Surratt, who had eluded capture for 2 years and had finally been apprehended in Alexandria. So Jeffers was sent to bring him home in irons to Washington, D.C., which he did. In 1870, Jeffers received his official promotion to captain. 1873, he became the chief of the Bureau of Ordnance. And in 1878, he was promoted to Commodore. On July 23, 1883, Commodore Jeffers died of kidney disease, and he's buried at the Naval Cemetery at Annapolis. And there is a photograph of his tombstone at the Naval Academy Cemetery at Annapolis, Maryland. Now, despite what the crew and his fellow officers may have thought of the irascible Commodore Jeffers, the Navy thought highly enough of him to name a destroyer after him, the USS Jeffers, in 1942, during World War II. Well, what happened to the Monitor, you ask? Well, I'm glad you asked that question. She didn't last a year. She was she sunk. She was going down to take part in the blockade of the port of Wilmington, North Carolina, the Confederate port, and she was being towed by the USS Rhode Island. And when she was rounding Cape Hatteras, a storm struck, and the ship was never very seaworthy anyway, and she began to take on water, and eventually she would sink. Now, there's a story about one of a landsman by the name of Francis Butts, yes, Butts, B-U-T-T-S, who was helping to bail water out of the ship. He was in the top of the turret, and they were passing buckets up to him, and he would dump them out. And as he was doing this, there was a cat who had been part of the crew, I suppose, and she kept meowing, and it was very distraught, obviously, and it was really getting on Francis Butts' nerves. So he picked up the cat and put her in one of the cannon tubes, one of the Dahlgren guns, and put the stopper in it, although he could still hear the cat. Sadly, the cat went down with the ship. 16 lives were lost. There's a crew of 63. 16 went down with the ship. They were unable to be rescued by the USS Rhode Island. So that was 4 officers, 12 seamen, and 1 cat. Now, for years and years, the Monitor lay in what was known as, or still known as, the graveyard of the Atlantic, until they brought up the turret. Now, they couldn't bring up the whole ship. It had deteriorated so much, and of course it's so heavy. But they brought up the turret, and it is now being restored at the Mariners Museum in Newport News, Virginia. And there's a photograph of the turret, and there, all those years, 140 years of marine growth is being carefully taken away, rust and so forth, and done with great care. And here, outside of the museum, is a full-scale replica of the USS Monitor. And there's someone standing there to give you an idea of the size of it. And that's a full-scale model of the turret and the deck. Well, it's been fun talking with you guys once again. And you should call all your friends and neighbors and tell them all about Commodore Jeffers being from Swedesboro and commanding the USS Monitor. In the meantime, you have a good couple of weeks, and I'll be back. And just remember, stay afloat.